Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Black Studies Podcast. Today, we have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Ronald Zeigler, former director of the Nyumburu Cultural Center at the University of Maryland for 25 years. He's also a colleague who is adjuncted in the African American and Africana Studies Department and has been an integral part of the Black community at Maryland for 47 years. How are you doing today, Dr. Zeigler?
I'm doing fine, Dr. Newby. Thank you for having me this afternoon.
Well, thank you so much for being here. Let's dive in. So, the first question I wanted to ask you was, how did you get into Black Studies as a field, and what kept you committed to doing the work of Black Studies for so long?
That's a great opening question. Um, excuse me. Actually, I guess going back to my undergraduate years, um, it wasn't directly like a job per se in Black Studies, but one summer I worked. I graduated from the university or the State University of New York at Stony Brook, and I worked in a program during the summer. My One of my coaches recommended me to be to work with the Upward Bound program, which University of Maryland has an Upward Bound program during the summer, and I worked with those students during that. I guess my junior and senior years. Actually, my sophomore and junior years at Stony Brook in the Upward Bound program, and I took quite a few. It was called Black Studies during that time. I'm a baby boomer, so I'm kind of like dating myself, but I have a long history with Black Studies, and in the 1960s, uh, seeing the cultural arts movement with people like Amiri Baraka and Sonia Sanchez and many others who contributed to Black Studies. Uh, um, Aki Manabuti, for example, during that time. And anyway, to make a long story short, so I taught a class. Actually, it was a co-taught class for high school students, and I was an undergraduate student, and I enjoyed it, quite a bit. And one of my professors, Canute Paris, uh, he also came in and he gave us tips on Black studies and what was happening in African American studies. And I became acquainted with people who it's interesting, many, many years later. For example, Dr. Ronald Walters, who's an ancestor now. There was a publication that came out called the Black Collegiate, and he was the author of that. And I used to read that very faithfully. I used to come out, and I used to talk with Dr. Paris, Canute Paris, one of my African American Studies professors at Stony Brook, about Dr. Walters. And it's interesting how many years later, um, I worked in the same campus and got to know him fairly well before his transition. He's one of my mentors and idols. So anyway, going back to my undergraduate, so I enjoyed it very much, and then I also tutored mathematics and also English during the academic year to those students, and so I became, really involved. So, as an undergraduate, I had a bachelor's degree, or obtained a bachelor's degree, I should say, in political science. And then I went on to pursue a master's in history education. And I continued to work with the Upward Bound program, working with teaching courses, history and government related classes during the summer, and also uh, called civics education during the academic year as a graduate student at Stony Brook. So that was like a very strong, I felt, introduction, because at that time that was kind of like the uh, beginning of African American studies or Black studies on predominantly white campuses, and there was lots of difficulties with the getting classes onto campuses, and that's how I was involved. I was involved with the Black Student Union, who pushed for classes like politics of race, politics of equality, uh, many classes that students take for granted in the 21st century. They don't know the struggle that happened back during the 60s and 70s to get those classes to become part of the curriculum of predominantly white campuses. So that was kind of like the introduction. Beyond that, um, as a graduate student, I again taught at Stony Brook, and then as a professional, I worked at a college, Atlantic Community College, in New Jersey, and I taught Black philosophies and also, I guess, the equivalent of your Introduction to African American Studies 100 class to adult learners. So that was again a continuation. Then went on and pursued my doctorate here at the University of Maryland in College Park, where I've taught many different types of classes, not just within African American and Africana studies, but also within family studies and also the College of Education as well. Professionally, I became involved with the Association of Black Cultural Centers, which is the Nyumburu Cultural Center. And for those podcasters who may not know, Nyumburu is a Swahili word which means freedom house. And Nyumburu has been at the University of Maryland for 54 years on the campus. So it's been my honor, or was my honor, to have been director for 25 years, succeeding the great James Otis Williams, who was the founder and had the vision to establish the Nyumburu Cultural Center at the University of Maryland. So that kind of, in a nutshell, is like a cursory summary kind of view how I became involved in Black studies or African American and African American and Africana studies.
Thank you. Can I ask a follow-up question?
Absolutely.
So, I am curious as to what are some things that you have noticed that have changed over time in Black studies?
Well, we could spend a whole day talking about that. Um, but uh, I would highlight what I think some of the things that I've noticed as a professional and also um, as I guess one of the early um, undergraduates who took classes in African American studies. So one thing which has definitely happened is the quote unquote the participation.
Mhm.
I'm not trying to criticize or indict, Gen Ed or millennials or but with baby boomers, it was like really like a labor of love. It was something that was really, taking classes, seeing people like Amiri Baraka and writers like Sonia Sanchez and artists, um, Thelonious Monk, to come onto your campus. Uh, Miles Davis. I mean, the Black studies encompass so much. Encompass the intellectual part. John Henry Clark,
Mhm.
Muhammad Ali. Um, you know, Having them come on, to speak at your campus. That was such a uh, invigorating, ceremonial. A very. It was a great event. And these were kind of people that uh, were involved in the early advent of African American and Africana studies departments. And that kind of like galvanized students to take classes.
Mhm.
In classes like, you have 75, 100 people in those classes. And they bring in these speakers in and they would talk about social justice issues, the Black Panther Party, for example, or the NAACP, a lot of people may have had views of them as being a quote unquote conservative uh, organization that didn't do anything, but there were many people within an organization who, had to, they were fighting legal battles, and all that stuff was explained, you know. So there was so many different social activist organizations that supplemented the intellectual. It wasn't just intellect for intellect's sake. So that's something that's unfortunately definitely missing within the 21st century. If you talk to students now about taking, Africana studies classes, I don't think you get that same enthusiasm. You might get, um, a few who have that energy, to lock into that. And but during the civil rights era per se, there were so many people outside of the academy who went on to to foster, I guess, the issues to preserve Black history, to preserve African American studies. So, for example, like the weakening of affirmative action, for example, like in the '60s, we spoke out against that. I mean, it was just starting out, uh, but spoke out against the racial attacks on affirmative action. We spoke out against injustices. It spoke out against all the racial inequalities, access to higher education. The program that I was on, uh, the advancement of individual merit, it really supported students like myself. I was the first in my family to go to college, and I was honored to have been an AIM student. And that's something now. If we look at, the 21st century, and you look at society now, there's not only assault on of affirmative actions, there's been an assault on that for the last 30 years, but all these attacks on DEI, um, students should be like, and some campuses, they have been up in arms, in terms of, you look at Columbia or, other campuses, Brown. Um, but if you look at our campus, I'm not saying that students haven't done anything, but I think many ways we can do a lot more. So, all of those, the racial uh, assaults, the racial attacks, and uh, these are things that that need to be, in my opinion, at least, um, it has to be an ongoing impact, an ongoing assault. You know, uh, so I think in many ways that quote unquote, uh, conservatism that's being allowed to continue, not just by the wider society, but also within the Black community, within certain college administrations, you know, uh, the Black Faculty and Staff Association, for example. They used to stand really strong with Nyumburu and dealing with issues of injustices. Another thing, it's kind of like an outgrowth of the issues, in terms of the changes that have been made. But there's a paucity of African American and faculty of color on predominantly white campuses. That's uh, at one time there were like cluster hires that were made by campuses. So if I don't have the latest figures on it, but if you look at 2026 or 2025 to 2026 compared to say maybe like 1995 1995 up to 2000, there was a very concerted effort to get Black faculty, across all disciplines,
Mhm.
not just African studies, but the sciences, the behavioral sciences, the arts and humanities, for example. And now, when you talk about those kinds of things, you get silence, or you don't get the kind of response that will um, promote a campus where you have faculty that students can really look up as role models. For example, like with Asian students, they have, excuse me, the Yuri Treisman model, where Asian students have, he was a physicist, and he had a group of Asian students in California, if I'm not mistaken, that research, and he took those students, and he had mostly Asian role models. It's the same kind of thing. I remember when we started the Black Male Initiative in 2005 at the Nyumburu Cultural Center, for example. Dr. Ron Walters graciously gave his time and came to meetings on Saturday with students. And the reason that we started that program, both myself and Solomon Kamajan, uh, was because the head of the Black Student Union, Hank Rollison, and also Raheem DeWaldo, who's I think he was NAACP president. They asked if there was any Black faculty on campus, ironically, and I said, "Are you don't think they're Black?" He said, "No." We said, "We haven't seen any. They're taking classes. They're going in. They were like sophomores to juniors, and they had never taken a class with an African American faculty member." So I started the program and just recruited Solomon, and we started it in 2005. And we used to have so many students who participated in that. This was focusing on males because that was the group that had the most issues of retention and not graduating from University of Maryland College Park. And within a few years, we had improved that, like I think it was like 15 to 20% retention. Now, we didn't have a whole lot of money, but just as far as getting those students involved, letting them see that there were other people like them, who they were aspiring to become political scientists, or aspiring to become an historian, or aspiring to be a chemist. Uh, People like Dr. Gates used to come in and talk. Some people who have retired and are no longer here. Dr. Cordell Black, for example. So that's a change that unfortunately has happened uh, over the last, I'd say, 25 years or so. There's been a real, unfortunate decline in student participation, uh, in quote unquote, or enrollment. I mean, students may become possibly may get involved in um, activities like, attending a Kwanzaa program, or coming to events at Nyumburu, or going to events at the academic achievement programs, or going to events at your department, Dr. Newby. Um, but I'm talking about really getting out, being quote unquote advocates to deal with issues of injustice and access to higher education. And we're working with middle school students, through the Black Mill Initiative. We used to go out and recruit students and bring students on campus and talk about the positive value of getting a college education to students. And with within the last 5 to 10 years, I don't see as much activity trying to continuing that kind of legacy. So that's a definite change that I've seen. Additionally, the resources for um, Black studies, the resources for quote unquote DEI types of programs are definitely under attack now, in terms of the amounts of money. That's something um, that's unfortunately been uh, under a lot of scrutiny and also under a lot of observation. And the reports that are coming out are often invalid, but they still are being pushed um, by policy administrators, within the Trump administration, uh, to not have quote unquote DEI or programs that focus on issues of race, for example.
Mhm. So I have another follow-up question. So
Of course.
um, you mentioned that, like, when you were taking African American or Black studies courses, that there would be, like, artists and activists and people from outside of the academy who would come on campus, and that would really inspire students and get them excited. Um, Now, I know not every PWI has both a Black Studies department and a Black Cultural Center. And so I'm curious as to what you see as the singular role that Black Cultural Centers can play on a campus, even if there is a department that offers the classes. How does the Cultural Center allow for a third space for Black students and faculty, that isn't necessarily tied to some of the requirements of, like, faculty in a department, but also allow students to come together?
Okay. The cultural centers, as I mentioned, the Borough is part of the Association of Black Cultural Centers, the ABCC. Um, they have uh, been in existence. I was director for New World for 25 years. They came out um, in the at least the, the Association of Black Cultural Center came out, and there are other organizations, but this is pretty much the cultural centers. There were approximately 200 Black ethnic or cultural centers throughout the United States of America. Every year they would have a conference. As a matter of fact, the Nyumburu Cultural Center sponsored two conferences. One in I think I know in 2014, and the other one, if I'm not mistaken, was either 1999 or 2000. So these cultural centers um, serve not only as a quote unquote safe space, but as a place where um, students of color, uh, Black students, could come together to have all kinds of activities. Where not just activities that impact the students on the campus itself, but also community members. I talked to colleagues throughout the entire United States, for example, um, and they talk about uh, how I guess the cultural center kind of like feeds the soul, so to
Mhm.
speak. It's a labor of love. It feeds the soul. You can bring in these artists. You can have jazz jam sessions. You can bring in those speakers to talk about issues of health disparity. You can bring speakers in to talk about issues of not just racism, but issues of what causes racism, what are issues of poverty in America, what's um, the trend of the government in terms of trying to eradicate or deal with poverty, for example. Many different kinds of things. Um, some musicians, for example, they who come in. If you look, the question that you asked me earlier, I guess is kind of like related.
Mhm.
Uh, this question about the cultural center. If you go back, really, I would say maybe to the 80s and 90s, where if you took a music like jazz or blues, rap, hip hop, all of those musics were not popularized and not respected up and down the white campuses. They just weren't.
Mhm.
There was no degrees for them. Like now, you have uh, jazz studies departments all around the United States. You have community colleges that have jazz studies departments. But back in the 80s and 90s, you didn't have that. So those artists uh come in, they would play the music, and then our white colleagues, they tried to devalue the music, and say that, this was not Western music. It wasn't, it wasn't respectable music. And the reason that they did that was because they couldn't play it, so they couldn't play it, so they tried to devalue it. And students of all races and all colors, and they would say, "No, well, we like the music. We're going to the cultural center because they're gonna have Thelonious Monk over there tonight, or they're gonna have Bill Harris, and we had the Naboo Jazz Club or whomever. We can go there. We can have an awakening program." So these cultural centers help to foster the retention and the graduation of those students. They were, that they had that kind of power. I said earlier, it's kinda like feeding the soul. So this is a way to feed the soul. So, but anyway, just the analogy I was talking about as far as the jazz studies department, um, there were, uh, faculty members who would say, like, "Hey, jazz and blues, you know, they would give the impression and they would say, "It's easy to learn." It's not easy to learn. You have to learn chords and patterns and uh, uh, progressions, and I don't know if it's timely. I don't want to digress too much, but I can tell you a story which I think is apropos. I recall a student many years ago who said he went to his teacher and he wanted to learn jazz. So he said, "Well, you learn this and you learn this song, and then next week we can teach you jazz." And he was in my jazz club. His teacher told him that, 'cause he came to Nyumburu to learn how to play. He could play classical music, and he could read and everything, but he couldn't improvise. So, he went back and he learned the song for his private instructor, and so he said, "Okay, can you teach me jazz now?" So he says, "I tell you what, you learn one more song, and I'll teach you how to play jazz." He practiced the other song and got that down, and he went back, and he says, "Okay, I played it now." He says, "Okay, now you teach me jazz." He said, "No, I want you." He said, "No, I'm not gonna learn any more songs. I want to learn jazz now." You know what the faculty member said to him? This is University of Maryland faculty member. He says, "I can't play jazz." So he gonna string this guy along all this time. So that says a lot, And then I've heard, remarks that I want, I don't want to dignify a response, but talk about. But people have just demeaned the kind of music that's played, like, within the cultural center movement. So, the music, the history, the legacy, the gospel music, the hip hop, the blues, the jazz, all of those musics, those oral tradition types of musics, uh, requires a lot of work, just like classical music. You have to learn to read that music, but you also have to learn to hear it. But they're not a lot of people aren't willing to do that. So drama, that's another thing. There are plays that come out of Nimburu. If you go to like the Paul Robeson Center at Rutgers University, or you go to the Black Cultural Center, uh, um, the Hale Center at Ohio State University, where our esteemed vice president, that was his campus, um, um, uh, attended, and I have a colleague who was there, and he told me, he said, yeah, he said, our vice president, he used to love to come to our center. I said, oh, okay. Well, he knew he could get some good music, learn something too. Yeah, yeah. But yeah, yeah. So the cultural centers, like Nimburu, like Ohio State, and even some of the smaller schools, um, They have uh, traditions associated with uh, with music, with history, uh, with politics, with activism. So the cultural centers have been in, worked hand in hand with the African and African American Africana Studies departments since their inception.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So, because you did talk about, especially the musical aspect, right? And role that Black cultural centers played in bringing jazz music and other types of music in the Black tradition to college campuses in a way that ultimately was professionalized and taken more seriously. Um, I want to follow up on that and just ask you to expand on why college students should be taught the importance and the relevance of these cultural legacies that are associated with the musical, artistic, dramatic, and performing arts. And, right, since you are both, you are an administrator and an instructor, but you're also an artist, I would be really curious to hear your perspective also from as an artist on that question.
Okay. So if I understand your question, you're asking why should students uh, know the importance of the arts
Mhm.
in their overall education,
Yes.
in terms of their value to them as quote unquote scholars, as aspiring scientists or educator or whatever it might be.
Right.
It's the important.
Especially right now, right,
Yeah,
with so
yeah,
much emphasis being put
yeah,
on the STEM fields and going into hard sciences or
yeah,
fields that are seen to make more money. Why
yeah,
is it important that we maintain those cultural elements in a student's education as well?
yeah. Well, that can be answered, I guess, a couple different ways. Um, I know one of my mentors, James Otis Williams. I remember him kind of addressing the question in a way, and and I kind of agree with him. Not kind of, I do agree with him in the way that you can be a James Latimer, or you can be a Ron McNair. You can study physics, and you can study chemistry, and you can be a Ben Carson, and study medicine, for example. But you're like a robot, you know. You can be like a robot, you just you know how to do all those scientific, which is great. I love math, and I love to do math. But it's like you, your stuff breathes. You know what I mean? Like you have an artistic side. Show that you're not just like shallow. It's Ron McNair. The astronaut who was killed in the shuttle mission. He was a great saxophonist. For example, I mean, I can go on and on. About artists who had not just the scientific part of them, but also they had the artistic side, the human side, and I think that kind of like comes out, to not only make you a better person, but it makes you. And I'm not trying to be like egotistical in saying this, but if you can maybe, it doesn't have to be, you have to be a musician necessarily, but say you like writing or you like poetry or you like painting or whatever, that's a skill that you have that the other person doesn't have. You know what I
Mhm.
mean? Not just for ego sense, but also something that you can use to enhance your community, to enhance you. Like all this stuff with AI, for example. It's like, yeah, I guess it takes a very creative person to come up with all those scripts of an AI profile, for example. But where's the human side to it? It's no, when you call up and you just get a whole bunch of robotic talk on, thank you and hold on and put your social number in. I'm not trying to overly simplify it, but it's kind of like the same thing as I see it. You're not really utilizing your skills. So, and really, the arts, they help you in so many ways to have a better understanding of things like mathematics, for example. Like, all the different, if you look at all the scales, the modes, the Ionian, the Dorian, the Lydian, the Mixolydian, the all the minor scales, the major, the the different kinds of chordal progressions that one has to learn, the extensions, all of those things. It's the same thing with mathematics. So if you understand the relationship of, like being able to make adjustments to chords and scales, you can learn the same thing you learn about numbers. You learn about prime numbers, composite numbers, you learn about um what's the improper fraction. I mean, those are like basic math, for example. But a lot of students, and nowadays with the onslaught on Black studies, where they're saying, that's s- s- you don't have to learn that, but you do have to learn it. You do have to learn that, you know what Rosa Parks did, or you do have to learn about Martin Luther King or Malcolm X or whomever. I'm not going on, but I'm saying, so to learn just a science and think that the science doesn't have a value or the arts didn't have a value. Those people who sang those songs, those songs had a meaning. Those blues songs had a meaning, and those blues songs led to freedom. Wading in the water, for example. That had to do with the Underground Railroad and trying to escape. So when you go into your first job and you work there for 10 years and you don't get a promotion and you don't know what's happening to you and you think everything is fine and you got a degree in engineering, but you're still at that lowly beginning level engineering, and I'm just using engineering as an example, position, and why didn't you get promoted? Well, the meritocracy is not working, I guess. You know what I'm saying? So, uh, that's an example. Like, I don't think I know that when you study the humanities, you study the arts, you study music, you study drama, you study poetry, you're learning about communications. And even in the 21st century with all this AI stuff, you have to communicate. At one time, a degree was unnecessary, but you need more than that in the 21st century for sure. A degree may get you in the door, but you have to be able to get along with people. You have to uh, take an internship or show that you can get along with people because there are all k- kinds of people who are waiting for your position or that position that you're seeking, and you might have a degree, but it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. You need more than just a degree. So I think that the having an understanding um, of humanity and the behavioral sciences and all of those things that I spoke about, that will help you to um, become not only a better person, but also to to be more effective and function better within the corporate world.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So building on that question,
Mhm.
um, given all of the attacks on diversity programming and access in higher education. Um, why is there a what do you think, right, should be the imperative um, of preserving not just understandings of Black history and actual Black history, not this rewritten layer of history that is being promoted in certain places, but also a need to preserve and support Black cultural centers um, on campuses today.
Okay. So the importance of Black cultural centers today in terms of continuing legacy of students attending predominantly white campuses or just campuses in general.
Yes, but particularly given all of the recent attacks, right? So given all of the attacks and the limiting the increasing limitations on funding, uh, what is the importance of Black cultural centers today?
Oh, okay. Well, to be quite honest, it it's really scary. And it's a very scary thing. Because I'm sure you've been reading the news like we all have been. When you get rid of um like African or try to get eliminate, like statutes, to the greats. Um when you try to get rid of the African American Studies Museum in Washington, DC, for example. To get rid of cultural centers, um, pretty soon you're gonna be abolishing not just the cultural centers, you're gonna be abolishing um, African American Studies departments. You're gonna be abolishing the Jazz Studies departments. You're gonna be getting rid of not only just the diversity programming, and on and on and on. So it's a very dangerous, extremely dangerous um, policy or policies, I should say, uh, for those kinds of things to happen. So we can't let that happen. We should not let that happen. And that's why I say um, you don't have to necessarily major in African American studies, but my generation, we knew that the classes that we were taking would have some uh, impetus for us,
Mhm.
okay, in terms of our overall development and our overall um, enlightenment uh, as people. And students who may have grown up in the suburbs or, you know, and I've seen this. Unfortunately, I've seen this happen repeatedly. Um, listservs, for example, where you might have a listing of the nearly 3,000 black students who attend the university to talk about maybe activities that your department, African American Studies, has, or the Nyumburu Cultural Center, or any other department on campus that deal with issues of race and sexuality, um, diversity. And within you send out an email or tweet it or whatever, and students would I mean, these are freshmen. I'm not talking about like sophomores. These are freshmen. They would say, "Take me off this list. I don't want to be on this list." So that shows a lack of identity. When you could talk about identity politics. Uh, now, it, the question you asked earlier about what has changed over the years. I saw that number increase over the last 25 years or so by more and more freshmen who didn't quote unquote want to be involved like with Nibiru. Like, that's not something I want to get involved with. And they felt a quote unquote certain stigma. Not all, not all. Um, if you have a social program, hey, everybody's down for that. You have like a juke joint, and they can go and they can shake their behinds and have fun, and and that's cool. I was undergrad too, but you got to be serious too. So you come by and you hear speakers going to talk about assaults on education. Talk about ways in which you can become a scientist or going to get into med school. You might get a few people who may come, but the fact that I was at the cultural center, um, there was like a quote unquote stigma. I have some surveys to talk about that address that very issue. So if I'm answering your question, the thing as I see it, these attacks and folks, unfortunately, they drink the Kool-Aid and they believe that if you go into that building, you only go in there like if you have some difficulties. And see, that's when a lot of them do come. They get difficulties, but if they're not getting any kind of difficulty, they're not coming. But if they're getting some kind of academic difficulty, or they're getting some difficulty on campus where they had a run in with somebody and they or a professor said something or they had to go before the judicial board or whatever, then they'll come into a place like Nyumburu or your department, African Africana Studies, or AMSI or whatever, possibly diversity and inclusion or belonging, as it's known now. So these assaults are really they're dangerous. They're really really dangerous because you have a false narrative that's being put out there, and folks are not believing that these legacies that I've spoken about for the last hour or so are not true, but they are true. I'm a living testament of that, and so are you. In terms of the importance of not just the cultural centers, but people who know that it's great to be a physicist or a chemist or whatever, but it's also great to if you have some artistic talents or athletic talents or whatever. And that's another thing I haven't spoken about. I'm glad we talked. The athletes. So athletes oftentimes, um, rightfully or wrongfully, uh, getting a lot of criticism for not being activists. They undergo a lot of scrutiny. You
Mhm.
know, uh, and I'm a former athlete, not a Division I, but Division II level. Uh, but I've always felt that athletics promotes involvement. Like um, Muhammad Ali, may his soul rest in peace, one of my early heroes, and he talked about like how like anybody could, learn to box, but he said, hey, he said that's something, like he had a God-given talent, but he says, he wouldn't want his son to be no boxer, I mean, but he knows the importance of education and people like Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, you know, but I'm just citing a few. If you look at like nowadays, Serena Williams, Venus, you know, there's so many things that deter people from getting involved in programs like Nimburu. There's so many distractions, money, you know. I'm not an expert on all this NIL stuff that's going on, but these are athletes, it's much different than
Yeah.
it was 25 years ago. So their allegiance now is like to getting that money, and I mean like the coach or whatever, or and or maybe even the professor. Like, what can the professor really teach me? I'm gonna make my money anyway. I'm gonna go to be and the next uh Venus Williams or be the next Michael Jordan or whatever. But even though they may not have the talent to do that, even the quote unquote average athlete, they might get $50,000, in NIL money. So what can you say to me? Why do I have to come to your program? I got $100,000 in IO money that I'm getting. I'm driving this Porsche around campus or whatever car they drive. I don't know. Hopefully not a, um, what's that car? Tesla. Hopefully not, or whatever car they driving. Um, there's so many distractions within the 21st century, and that's why I think students should always remain grounded, in their history, because even though it's good to inspire, to make all the, for the athletes, but the other students, they might not approach it that way, but they'll say, "Hey, I don't need, that stuff happened years ago. That race stuff, man. That's done." You know, but no, it's not done. You could find out the hard way
Yeah.
that, that that's not done. You run into some problems, in the classroom or whatever. But so anyway, that's what I got to say on that one.
Thank you.
You're
Uh,
welcome.
so I want to be respectful of your time.
I'm
Um,
fine. I'm
is there
fine.
anything you would like to add that we have not covered yet so far?
Um, I would like to just say that there's a lot there's a lot of responsibility on uh mm, Gen Z, millennials, uh I feel, because and Gen Xers, I guess, who maybe um uh students of color, uh to continue, or to perpetuate a legacy. And with that responsibility and pressure, I think there's so many digressions, there's so many societal things that can impact them, and get them to feel that you know race is not important or gender is not important. But in reality, you do have to think about, um with your commitment, particularly, as I saw it, I'm working as a director of a cultural center, work with students of all races and ethnicities. Um, but our target population was students who are African American, African, and Caribbean. That was our target population. But students of color um, experience lots of difficulties, not only just financial, but also difficulties in terms of support when it comes to uh, being part of the campus or being part of the quote unquote mainstream. So that's where, like, cultural centers, like, you go to classes, and you might have a physics class where you have 50 people, and you might have one person that looks like you in there, and you experiencing difficulties, or calculus class. Um, so those are the problems. Those are the areas that really need to be impacted by people like a Ron Walters, or a Dr. Bill Gates, or Erling Armstrong, who's also a faculty member emeritus from the University of Maryland. She was an entomologist. She worked in the Obama administration. For people have people like that who um, can impact undergraduates. So without these kinds of mentors to be available, then I think that in lots of way that weakens the pipeline for students of color. And that's why I see the importance of having, like, Africana and Black studies, cultural centers, um, to perpetuate that kind of positiveness that's under attack.
Mhm.
And if anything comes out of this interview, I hope that the assault on DEI is looked at as something that's really serious. And I hope that we can continue to preserve Black history through the podcast, for people who are listening to this podcast.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your
Thank
time,
you.
um,
Thank you for having me.
and for all the work that you did at Maryland for
Yes,
7 years.
appreciate it.
So
And I wish you the best in your career and in terms of continuing that legacy of uh, enrollment and maintaining the excellence uh, of Dr. Holly and all your other colleagues over there in your department. And I hope that things continue and your enrollments thrive. Okay, I
that
hope they thrive. And uh, takes, yeah, yeah, we might smile about it, we might laugh, but we know we have a lot of work to do.
yeah,
Even in retirement, we have a lot of work to do. Um, and you have a lot of work to do that you deal with every day. So keep the flames burning. Keep the flames burning, and let those students know that hey, don't think that if you can become a scientist or whatever that you know that you, you don't have an obligation to help those others that preceded you, because you wouldn't be here without them.
right.
Okay.